Um, all of these things have this kind of, connection. So you really can't dismiss, oh, these are just hippies or these are just whatever. I mean, it becomes kind of part of the anti-war movement. When Martin Luther King talks about Vietnam, that's that kind of intersection there, right? Where King is linking civil rights and the Vietnam War. Now, there's one of the common arguments is that the Vietnam War kills civil rights because the war becomes an issue, the war takes funding away. And, and by civil rights, I mean what I haven't talked about because it's really kind of part of this idea of liberal reform. Johnson announces a program in 1965, which is going to be called the Great Society. And one of the key parts of the Great Society is what he calls the war on poverty. And he announces government programs that will address these problems that groups like the Civil Rights Movement or SDS is calling out, right? Now, the Great Society will include racial equality. We don't necessarily consider the Civil Rights Law or the Voting Rights Law as parts of the Great Society, but they're clearly, attached to the overall idea. The Great Society was funded at cumulatively, about $8 billion. Now, Great Society is where you get things like Medicare, Medicaid, things like that, programs which have still attacked today. Great Society liberalism, right? The Great Society was funded at about $8 or $10 billion cumulatively. That's like 6 months in Vietnam, right? Johnson wasn't a radical, much like FDR wasn't a Keynesian. Johnson was never going to do much more than he did. Johnson wasn't going, I mean, look what he did with the CAP programs. As soon as that money went to people who were challenging Daley's allies, boom, that program was cut. That program was ended, right? Johnson preferred to give money to local elites, which they could then give to their cronies, right? That was his idea of reform. So radical reform was never in the books. And the kind of stuff that King and others are talking about in the United States constitutes radicalism. Jobs, housing, participatory democracy, tenants unions, welfare rights organizations. In the United States, in the 1960s, was considered radical, right? At the end of the day, and like I said before, I don't mean to be discouraging, but at the end of the day, what's the outcome of all these struggles? Great successes, the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act, for whatever reasons, the Vietnam War does end. Clearly school desegregation moves apace, and there are clearly some great successes. But at the end of the day, what's the overall kind of outcome of these attempts, these movements, or these mobilizations? Does this fundamental structure of the United States change? No, in fact, what you're going to see is a backlash. And we'll talk about this more when we start talking about the hippies and some other stuff, which I hope to go through quickly, the counterculture. But what you have is a backlash. And in fact, in the aftermath of the 60s, which in many ways is the most radical era in US history, right? You have the most conservative era, beginning with Reagan all the way through contemporary times, except in one area, culture. Culturally, the counterculture won the day. I mean, if you look at, like I said before, TV commercials today would have been like merely X-rated movies back in the 1950s and 60s. The stuff they show in commercials today, you wouldn't have seen anywhere in the 1950s and 60s. You can have TV shows, making jokes about smoking dope. On Fox, the most conservative channel. I mean, think of this. Fox is by far the most conservative channel, right? Absolutely. Who would question that, right? Yet Fox has on the '70s show, every episode of which contained, people sitting around getting high, and The Simpsons, which is the most subversive show in TV history. And that's what I mean about commodifying things. When you present them in a certain way, they don't have political impact, and that's what's done to the 1960s. 60s is a serious era. I often, say, I kind of frame the 60s with the idea of questioning authority. Because if there's one particular lesson that comes out of that era, it's that you should question authority. That's what the New Left is saying, that's what the Civil Rights Movement is saying, that's what the hippies are saying. You shouldn't blindly follow and defer to people because they're the power elite, because they have authority. You should question everybody and everything, right? And what happens is that's lost because we tend to be caught up in the kind of trappings of it. Tie-dyed shirts and bell-bottoms were initially actually a political statement. We're not going to dress in a gray flannel suit. We're not going to drink 3 martinis at lunch. We're going to wear jeans and a tie-dye shirt and smoke dope, right? Well, pretty soon, boutiques in New York City are selling bell-bottom jeans for $80 and tie-dye shirts to all these, Upper West Side men and women, and it becomes kind of this hip couture, and it loses its guts that way, right? I mean, it's only a matter of time before you see, a Armani does Occupy Wall Street, or Marc Jacobs, the Occupy line, or something like that. It's inevitable, right? DKOWS, So, these concepts tend to be bought and sold, and they lose their vitality. The '60s was a radical era by American standards, absolutely. These were people who were attacking the fundamental structure of the United States. It's racist, it's classist, it's anti-democratic. And I mean, Occupy Wall Street, you're hearing much of the same rhetoric, right? Especially about democracy and people's rights. So the '60s matters. And does it end up successful? Depends on who you're talking to. But it matters. It's not simply a way to sell jeans or to sell Mercury Cougars, all right? Any questions? All right.